Frank Church left his house in Westbourne Grove, Northcote, and made his way to the front gate at around 7:40 in the morning on Tuesday, December 21st, 1982. The trash cans were collected the night before, and Frank was planning to return his empty can to the house. Just as Frank was about to leave his house, he saw Marin, his next-door neighbor, standing on the sidewalk outside her house. Bonnie, Marin's 6-year-old daughter, and Frank had only lived on Westbourne Grove for 27 years. About 2 years ago, they relocated to the inner-city street of Melbourne. The residential street was large and rather calm, despite the near proximity of the Victorian terrace homes. Beyond exchanging pleasantries whenever they ran across one another, Frank had no actual knowledge of Moran or Bonnie. Marin yelled out to Frank, "Frank! Frank!" The second he caught sight of him, Frank could see by the young mother's expression that she was quite distressed and by the tears that were streaming down her cheeks. Frank went up to Moran, worried. Her sobs intensified as she knelt on his shoulder and cried out, "My baby is dead," asking, "What do you mean your baby is dead?" Frank probed more. "My daughter Bonnie was stabbed," Marin said in response. Frantic, Frank threatened to contact the authorities after telling Moran what had happened. Moran claimed she had already done so before continuing to scream and cry while seeming helpless as she rested her head on Frank's shoulder. Mavis, Frank's wife, heard Marin's distressed cries as she was rising from bed. As a plea for assistance, Frank started to yell out Mavis's name. Putting on a dressing robe, Mavis ran outdoors to find out what was going on. A young mother who had only known Moran as a kind face on the street was suddenly a crying mess in Frank's embrace. "It's her little girl," Frank said. Immediately, Mavis bolted toward Moran's house. The entrance door was ajar. The first room that Mavis peered into seemed to be Moran's bedroom. A lengthy corridor stretched the length of the house on the right side, while an additional oval-shaped corridor connected Moran's chamber to the left side of the house. In her haste, Mavis glanced into every door down the corridor. There was an apparent guest room in the second bedroom, but Bonnie's bedroom was in the third. The floor was covered with children's clothes and toys. There was a bunk bed across from a single bed that was pulled up against a wall. An illuminated nightlight rested on a nightstand. The little Bonnie Clarke lay on her back on the one bed. With her arms hanging loosely by her sides, she sat nude, her bottom half covered by a blue doona tied at the waist. Pretty much the second Mavis laid eyes on Bonnie, she was so pale. Just below her breast, she exhibited a crimson cut. Raising Bonnie's neck, Mavis hoped to administer CPR in the hopes of saving the girl's life. A chill ran down Bonnie's spine. Prior to that, Mavis checked for a pulse. Neither did she. As soon as Mavis saw that Bonnie had died, she threw down her hands and bolted out of the room. At the same time, 2 constables arrived in their patrol vehicle outside Westbourne Grove, having been summoned by Marin Clarke. Upon arriving at her residence, they saw Marin positioned on the sidewalk, shackled by Frank Church. Out of nowhere, Marin wrenched herself from Frank's grip and swung her leg at a little terrier loitering nearby. She yelled at the dog, asking, "Why didn't you bark? You always bloody bark. Why didn't you bark?" The police officers rushed to the bedroom of 6-year-old Bonnie. With the exception of Bonnie, who lay still and chilly on her bed, the room seemed to be a typical child's bedroom. 2 paramedics arrived a short time after the constables and verified Bonnie's death. Bonnie had likely been dead for a while before rigor mortis set in. She had genital injuries and had been the victim of digital rape. The location did not provide any sperm. There was a little quantity of blood around a 3-centimeter stab hole in Bonnie's chest under her torso, and compressions to her neck indicated suffocation. Water had seeped into the mattress. The pillows that normally would have rested under Bonnie's head were instead propped up against the wall against which her bed was maintained. The cops discovered her pajamas tucked under the pillows, wedged between the wall and the mattress when they removed the bed. Blood was severely splattered on the pajama top. 2 slits made with a knife or scissors ran the length of Bonnie's underwear from the elastic waistline to the bands that would have held her legs. It seemed surprising that there was so little blood around Bonnie's real wound, considering the quantity of blood covering her pajama top. Evidently, after the murderer's knife wound to Bonnie, she was turned onto her stomach, undressed, and then bathed with water, soaking the mattress. It was clear that Bonnie had been stripped naked, since faint smears covered her chest. The police officials stayed at the Clarke house with Bonnie, while Frank and Mavis Church escorted Maren back to their home to console her. One of the constables contacted the Northcutt police station at 8:05 a.m. to ask for the assignment of Crime Investigation Bureau detectives and crime scene investigators to the location. The investigators showed up there over 15 minutes later and made mental notes on the property's arrangement. No evidence of forced entry was found, according to a crime scene investigator. Along the length of the weatherboard home, which had a single front, were 3 bedrooms arranged in a row with 2 hallways on each side. Following Bonnie's third bedroom was a living area furnished with a sofa and television. A little coffee table was a jumble of empty bottles and glasses, with the exception of a single beer bottle and a single soft drink container. You might find the kitchen, the laundry room, and the bathroom toward the back of the home. The washing room yielded yet another empty beer bottle. There was a Hills Hoist washing line with dry clothing dangling from it, 2 empty beer bottles, and a pair of tall double gates that led to a laneway in the rear yard, which was accessible via a sliding door in the kitchen. There were no markings or prints on either side to indicate that someone had climbed them, and they were closed. Bonnie and Moran, according to Moran, never utilized the rear gate or ventured into the laneway. Additionally, she clarified that while the entrance door was always secured, the back sliding door was never fully closed. The family's little terrier, Troy, could always get out of the house anytime he wanted to since the door was left slightly ajar. While Moomy, Bonnie's poodle chihuahua mix, slept on the bunk bed in Bonnie's room, Troy slept off on the sofa in the living room. The discovery of a slightly open cutlery drawer in the kitchen led detectives to speculate that Bonnie may have been stabbed with one of the household knives. However, no weapon that matched her injuries was found. Bonnie Clarke was officially interrogated in the presbytery of a church that also stood on Westbourne Grove after a quick interview in her house as Bonnie's corpse lay in her bed. The night before had been calm, according to Moran. The one hitch was that Bonnie was reluctant to return to her own bed. Rather than getting with Moran, she had requested to sleep with her. The nighttime frightened Bonnie. It was because of this that she would never go to sleep without leaving the nightlight on and the door slightly ajar. Even with Bonnie's cherished dog, Moomy, cuddled up on the bunk bed in her room, the small girl still needed something to help her relax. Bonnie had asked Moran to do something, but he was too exhausted and hesitant to accept. Even though Moran's calendar was typically packed in the days leading up to Christmas, this year was more so. She was a nurse by day and a full-time student at night, preparing for final exams. Moran was especially eager for a good night's sleep since she is a single mother and does not have a partner to share the burden. Moran urged Bonnie to go to her room and sleep, saying, "Sleep in your bed. Santa won't know where to find you." Bonnie complied, and Moran tucked her in at 8:30 that night, highlighting that there were only 4 more days before Christmas. Moran had retired for the night before 11 p.m., awakening just once at around 1:30 a.m. to use the restroom. As she passed her daughter's room, she stopped to see how she was doing. While Bonnie was awake, Moran went and brought her a drink after she requested one from her mother. Immediately after that, the mother and daughter both slept out again. The ringing of the telephone had roused Moran just before 7 o'clock in the morning. Her employer, a nursing agency, wanted to know whether she could start a shift immediately. Upon accepting, Moran wasted little time in getting dressed. She stole a quick peek into Bonnie's room on her way to the restroom. She saw that Bonnie remained fast asleep on her own bed, with her duvet drawn up to her chin. Dressed, and breakfast was prepared by Moran. When Moran saw that Bonnie was still fast asleep at 7:45, she decided to go wake her up. Moran had a gut feeling something was up the moment she walked up to Bonnie's bed. Bonnie lay still, her face as pale as chalk. The doona covering the bed was raised by Moran's arm. While her arms rested at her side, Bonnie lay on her back beneath. There was a gaping hole in her chest. Her neck looked damaged, and she was shirtless. As soon as she heard the news, Moran knew her daughter had died, she claimed. She called the police in a state of distress. Moran bolted out onto the street, unable to remain in the home any longer as her daughter lay lifeless. She hurried to her neighbor, Frank Church, seeking solace as she stood on the sidewalk outside. In Moran's mind, Bonnie had to have been murdered by a thief who had broken into the house while he was asleep. The investigation was assigned to Detective Senior Sergeant Eric Lilly, who was the primary murder investigator. The account that Moran gave Detective Lilly was not convincing. To begin, no one heard the family's dogs barking all night long. even Maren and her neighbors. But it was well known that both dogs would bark nonstop anytime an unknown person visited the home. The arrangement was so complicated that any would-be invader would have had a tough time finding their way to Bonnie's chamber. The culprit must have gotten in via the back sliding door, which was left slightly ajar because the front door was secured and latched. However, there was a beaded curtain hanging at the rear entry to the home that, when stepped through or pulled aside, created a noise. The corridor leading to Bonnie's room had a string of potted plants strung from the ceiling. Because of this, a clumsy intruder would have been caught unawares and would have had a hard time getting to Bonnie without scaring her mother. Also, Maren denied hearing anything. Nobody in the neighborhood saw or heard a trespasser or anything out of the ordinary. Someone who was familiar with the house seemed to be the obvious suspect. The house was inhabited only by Maren and Bonnie. Maren said that she had abandoned Bonnie's father, Dennis, because of his violent episodes and drinking. Dennis had a strong alibi for the 20th of December and was swiftly eliminated from the inquiry, even though this description may have implicated him. Detective Lilly was wary of Bonnie's mother for some reason. There was no semen found, and the attack on Bonnie had been digital, despite the fact that the murder of Bonnie seemed to have sexual elements. All of this pointed to Maren as the most likely female perpetrator, and Detective Lilly began to assume that a woman was responsible for the murder. Maybe Moran's rage had flared up because of something. In her enraged wrath, she had murdered Bonnie, and then she attempted to stage a sexual assault to cover up her crime. The investigator also considered Bonnie Clarke because of other details at the murder site. The abundance of empty beer bottles found on the premises was a red flag for investigators, suggesting lax parenting and lack of morality. While Bonnie's lifeless corpse lay in the room across from Detective Lilly's couch, Lilly didn't mince words when he had his first chat with Maren. "You did it, didn't you?" he said. Maren vehemently denied murdering her kid, responding, "No, I didn't do it." She pleaded with us to provide immediate assistance. "Why you say that is beyond me, because you have no idea who I am," Detective Lilly said. Very little tangible evidence was found at the crime site. No weapon or anything used to wash or wipe off Bonnie's corpse after the murder was found during the searches of the home and surrounding properties conducted by a total of 32 police. At first, the discovery of a white coat in the laundry with a little bloodstain was given significant weight. However, it was subsequently determined that this had no bearing on the crime. Fingerprints were checked by dusting the home and its contents. Two of Marian's associates who were known to frequent the property, her daughter Bonnie and Bonnie Clarke herself, were identified as the rightful owners of everything that was recovered. No prints were found that may be used to identify the perpetrator. His suspicions about Moran intensified as Detective Lilly continued to investigate the matter. Some of her acquaintances said she was physically and verbally abusive to Bonnie, while the majority of her acquaintances saw her as a kind mother. Maren has a little history of melancholy as well. She had put this down to the difficult time of transition she had endured while relocating from rural Victoria to Melbourne. Nevertheless, she had just contacted a parent's hotline due to the challenges she was encountering as a single mother. It seems like someone wasn't handling things well to Detective Lilly. He repeatedly asked Marian to do the interview, and she never said no. Her tone became more and more forceful and insistent whenever she addressed him. After over 5 hours of questioning Maren, Detective Lilly eventually inquired whether she would be open to hypnotization. It was his hope that this would shed light on whether or not she was covering up anything related to Bonnie's death that fateful night. After Maren gave her approval, the lawyer she had employed alerted the authorities. In the end, Marian decided she wouldn't participate in the hypnotism session and was revoking her agreement. Even though this proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Maren was guilty, Detective Lilly was unable to go further due to a lack of forensic evidence and a confession from his suspect. 2 months after Bonnie's death in February 1983, a young journalist from the Northcote Leader newspaper contacted the suburban homicide team to get their tale. One of the unsolved homicides in the region that journalist Ian Munro intended to write about was the one involving Bonnie Clarke. When Ian brought up the murder of Bonnie in his conversation with one of the Northcote detectives, the detective assured him that the case did not require any further publicity. Whoever was responsible was previously known to the police, but months went by with still no results. Other potential suspects' names might sometimes surface. Although Detective Lilly spoke with another person about Bonnie's murder, His inquiries yielded no results, and he continued to believe that Marion Clarke was guilty. A murder investigation concerning Bonnie's death was initiated in February 1984. In Detective Lilly's absence, Marion Clarke presented evidence. She was replaced by her lawyer. An unidentified assailant murdered 6-year-old Bonnie Clarke, according to the coroner's findings. The matter dragged on without any suggestions for charges to be leveled. At the same time, Marion Clarke was going through unfathomable loss. She waited for the nightmare that was Bonnie's death to end so she could finally wake up. Along with grieving her daughter's death, Marion was racked with remorse for turning down Bonnie's desire to sleep with her that night. Marion had the overwhelming need to stop over one day while driving. She started crying as soon as she did. The reality of her daughter's death became apparent at that time. While trying to make sense of Bonnie's murder, Marion had the distinct impression that the whole city of Melbourne was staring at her. It became intolerable to be in congested areas and to use public transportation. It felt as if everyone was gazing at her, criticizing her for being the worst kind of woman and mother. Strangers would sometimes call her at home and threaten her. "You did it, just admit it," a few of them said. They were just cut off by Marion. She had a sneaking suspicion that the cops would round her up every day. Because of her status as a single mother, she believed that Detective Eric Lilly had prejudice against her. "I honestly reckon he hated single mothers," Marion would clarify to a Sunday newspaper reporter afterwards. His obsession with single moms was serious. At first, Marion reluctantly consented to the detective's request that she undergo hypnosis, but after hearing Jill's support, she changed her mind. Jill cautioned Marion against being too open to suggestion because of her grief and suggested that she hire an attorney instead. When Marion found out that some people were saying she had physically abused Bonnie, she was shocked. She sometimes used yelling as a means of punishment, but she never physically beat her daughter. "No one's going to believe you," Detective Lilly once warned Marion. As discussed in episode 136 of Case File, the mother of infant Azaria Chamberlain Lindy went missing in the middle of 1980 while on a family camping vacation. "You're exactly like her." Bonnie was assassinated 2 months after Lindy's conviction for her daughter's murder. Years later, she would be freed and acquitted, although insisting on her innocence from the beginning. Marion was well aware that if Lindy Chamberlain's arrest was conceivable, she too might face the same fate. Marion withdrew from her undergraduate program. She thought of ending her life since she couldn't bear to deal with her loss. The one thing that prevented her from ending her own life was the fear of Detective Lilly's reaction. "I thought, no, as soon as you do that, that bastard's going to turn around and say, 'Guilt got her.' And he was not going to do that to Bonnie," Marion said in a 2006 interview with the Sunday Age. "I refused to allow them to close the book because they would have done so. She deserved more than that." Marion waited for the anguish to go away for a few years after Bonnie's death. A return to her usual self was something she hoped to achieve one day. However, Marion came to the realization that this would never happen on the 3rd anniversary of her daughter's death. "It hit me that I would just have to learn to live with the fact that it wouldn't go away. It was crazy, so I need to go to work on it. It was about time I stopped putting her needs above my own and began enjoying my life to the fullest." After meeting her future husband at a Catholic retreat, Marion decided to alter her name to Marion Wishart and be married. She uprooted her life in bustling Melbourne and settled at the coastal village of Wonthaggi, which was almost 150 kilometers distant. After marrying, Marion and her husband had 4 children. In the family's living room, on a dresser rested framed images of her offspring, with one of Bonnie's portraits of her dog, Moomy, positioned in the center. The disappearance of Bonnie's kid was a mystery even to her father, Dennis Clarke. There were no further developments in the case for over 20 years. It was around this period that Dennis's health started to deteriorate, leading to his cancer diagnosis. Dennis was determined to get the lawsuit closed before he passed away, since he knew his time was limited. In 2001, Dennis came upon an item about the establishment of the Victoria Police Department's cold case squad while perusing the newspaper. After seeing that the newspaper had named Detective Ron Idles, he decided to contact them personally by calling him. Dennis handed the investigator a picture of his daughter when the detective visited his house. He made it clear that he wanted the lawsuit settled. Idles, the detective, said he would review Bonnie's case file. The original case report was located, and Detective Idles and his partner Tim Day combed over its pages. Plus, they made an appearance in the media, something that Eric Lilly, their predecessor, had flat out refused to do. The cold case from 1982 was featured in a story published by the Herald Sun newspaper shortly after Detective Idle's meeting with Dennis. Kylie Ward, a lady in her mid-20s, was one of the readers of the piece. Since Kylie had been Bonnie's friend and had long worried about the fate of the young girl they used to play with, the case had special interest for her. On top of that, she had her own doubts about potential participants. After school from January through September of 1982, Kylie would visit Bonnie at her home to play. It was home to more than just Bonnie and Marion. After becoming a single mother, Marion had no choice but to rent out the third bedroom to a 28-year-old guy called Mal in order to make ends meet. Something about Mal gave Kylie the willies. She was aware that he evoked similar emotions in Bonnie. Mal stared at Bonnie often and would sometimes force her to sit on his knee. Bonnie had complained to Kylie about how strange he was. Bonnie was very wary of him, and Kylie could see she was trying to avoid him at all costs. Kylie couldn't get Mal out of her mind as a potential murderer, even though he had moved out 3 months before Bonnie's murder. When Kylie learned that the police in Victoria were reopening the case, she contacted them to provide her information. Detective Tim Day had been reviewing Bonnie's case file extensively, but upon receiving the tip-off from Kylie Ward, he couldn't recall ever reading anything about a border collie called Mal. Mal Clarke, he found after returning to the pages, was unrelated to Bonnie Clarke and her family. Just 3 months before Bonnie's death, he had become the latest boarder to live with Marion and Bonnie. Because he couldn't pay the rent, Mal moved into the home next door for about 1 month before moving in with his parents in the neighboring suburb of Brunswick. It became clear that not just Kylie, but others had also had suspicions about him. Just moments after the murder, Bonnie's mom, Marion, brought him up in conversation with Detective Eric Lilly. Being the only other person who had lived there for 9 months, she pointed out that he was just as acquainted with the house as she was. Knowing him so well, none of the dogs barked at him. Both the house's layout and the family's habits were familiar to Mal. The first investigators had talked with Mal. He claimed to have been working as an assistant projectionist at a movie theater that night, so he had a plausible excuse to avoid being arrested. After dismissing him in 1982, the police restarted their investigation. Tim Day, the detective, decided to go through the criminal records section for any information on a Mal Clarke. However, he came up empty-handed. The only person he could locate with any degree of certainty was Joe Clarke, a criminal with a history of violent convictions dating back to both before and after Bonnie's murder. Teresa Crow was a bubbly, extroverted, and amiable 22-year-old who liked dancing in June 1980. She loved going to Chase's, a disco in the Melbourne suburb of Pan, which was located in the city center. Because of her long tenure at Chase's, Teresa made many friends. She hurried from gathering to gathering, embracing everyone she knew with an enormous embrace. Teresa dropped by her friend Zena's office in the afternoon of Thursday, June 19, 1980, to tell her about her planned date at an exclusive restaurant. She exuded an air of joy and enthusiasm. Zena extended an invitation to Teresa to spend the evening at her apartment. According to Teresa, she needed to check in with her pizza place of employment that night to see if anybody needed her. She would visit if they did not. Since Teresa was absent that evening, Zena reasoned that she must have been at work. Teresa also did not show up for the arrangements that the two of them had set for the afternoon after that. Zena felt hurt that her buddy had betrayed her, but she didn't see anything wrong with it. There was silence from Teresa for a few days. Wednesday, June 25th, almost a week later, Teresa's employer became worried when she failed to collect her earnings. Simon, her landlord, was called and chose to visit her to see how she was doing. A little industrial loft area was hired by Teresa not far from the Chasers' dance, which she often visited. The note had been left for Teresa by Simon a few days previously and had been found on the ladder leading to her flat. He saw the note was still lying there, undisturbed, when he walked up to the ladder to check on her now. Climbing up to the trapdoor that led to Teresa's loft, Simon scrambled inside the cramped studio flat. The brick walls have a few photographs mounted on them. In one corner was a television, and in the other was a rack with Teresa's clothes. A love seat-style sofa dangling from the ceiling by ropes was the focal point of the space. Adjacent to the sofa, on the floor, lay what seemed to be a mannequin. its arms and legs wrapped in a delicate white blanket. Simon went over to the mannequin and removed a stray scrap of cloth off its head covering. The reality of the face under his shockwaves was shocking. Authorities were notified. They took their time gently removing Teresa Crow from the blanket after taking pictures of the situation. She wore nothing but her undergarments, her arms crossed across her chest. The killer had placed her in a delicate position before encasing her like a mummy. Numerous tiny grazes, bite marks, and abrasions marred her body, in addition to a horseshoe-shaped cut on her left face and cuts on her neck. Among her most distinctive features was a lengthy, black incision that reached all the way down to her crotch. Every layer of Teresa's flesh was sliced by it. The absence of blood indicates that this incision was done after the victim had died. The results of the autopsy would point to asphyxiation as the cause of death. The precise time of Teresa's murder remained a mystery to detectives. Despite being missing for over a week, her corpse exhibited few symptoms of decay. Nevertheless, it is possible that her bones were preserved due to the harsh winter weather. Some things pointed to Teresa being assaulted in the middle of the night as she was getting ready to go to sleep. There was no makeup on her face, and a jar on a drawer contained the contact lenses she used during the day. Near the swaying sofa, a nightgown lay on the floor. As if someone had been lying on them, a few of the sofa cushions were crushed. A smear resembling semen was also found. Based on this information, the investigation team theorized that Teresa was last seen at home one evening, possibly in bed or getting ready for bed, when an unannounced visitor turned up at her apartment. She opened the door for the guest. Subsequently, he abused her physically and sexually. The offender, according to the police, took off Teresa's nightie after striking her with a solid weapon, leaving a horseshoe-shaped wound on her face. Subsequently, he got Teresa face down on the swaying sofa. The assailant bit Teresa in the back as they struggled, and she also got a number of scrapes and bruises. Additionally, Teresa asphyxiated due to the pressure of one of the wooden armrests on her neck. After Teresa passed away, her murderer meticulously covered her in a blanket after cutting her down the middle, for reasons that remain a mystery. Police investigated the possibility of an occult connection to the murders after discovering the disturbing disfigurement and staging of Teresa's corpse. After interviewing hundreds of people and doing extensive research into Teresa's personal ties and social circles, investigators were unable to find any evidence to support this. Eventually, the investigation fell cold since they couldn't uncover any evidence that implicated a specific individual. On Friday, August 26, 1983, more than 3 years later, a woman named Jane, who was 25 years old at the time, was abruptly roused from her sleep at her house in Brunswick. Outside her bedroom, she had detected a squeaking noise. The sound was coming from the flooring. It sounded like someone was stumbling down the hall. "I was terrified, Jane. Even though their 5-year-old daughter was sound sleeping in her bed, her husband's night shift job made too much noise for her to identify as coming from her room." By her bedside, there was a rotary phone, and Jane seized it. She felt an enormous burden as a burly guy swooped down on top of her as she reached for the phone to call the cops. He brandished a knife and pierced one of Jane's legs, seriously injuring her. Smothering her lips with his other hand, he let go of the knife and wrapped one around her neck, stopping her from screaming. Biting down forcefully on the man's thumb, Jane desperately struggled to defend herself. "Let my thumb go," he insisted. He pinched Jane's neck since she paid him no attention. As a result, Jane stopped biting, and the guy became more confident. He then threatened to kill her if she made a mistake. After dragging Jane to the floor, the guy started talking to her as they lay there. According to him, 3 of his associates were waiting outside her house for him when he fled from jail. The guy proceeded to demand that Jane remove her nightgown after telling her that he had severed the breasts of another lady. Since Jane had been sleeping shirtless, she failed to grasp his suggestion. Assaults on her sexuality started by the male. Possibly startled by the noise, Jane heard her daughter yell for her while he did this. Leaning over the bed, the small girl had made her way to her mother's bedroom. There, she stared at her mother and her assailant, who lay on the floor. Jane persuaded her daughter to go back to bed, explaining that she and her dad were simply playing a game, in the hopes that her daughter wouldn't be able to see the man's face since it was too dark. Fearing for her daughter's safety, Jane pleaded with the guy, saying, "I'll do anything you want, but please don't hurt my daughter." In response to the man's threats, the small girl departed, and the man seized Jane by the neck and said, "How easy I could kill you. I could cut you up like the other girl." Over the course of 3 hours, the guy subjected Jane to many rapes while detailing his history of severe sexual assaults. She was repeatedly held at knife point. Moreover, he bit her many times. In order to report on the guy later, Jane attempted to commit information about him to memory. She could only feel his hair's texture, as it was too dark to see him. It had a gritty, sandy texture. Just before Jane's husband's usual 6:30 p.m. return from his night work, the guy finally departed. But before he left, he made sure the area was spotless by eliminating all signs of his presence. He informed her, "If you have a baby, I don't want you to get rid of it." After the attack, Jane went to the police and gave a detailed account. Just a few days after that, 2 detectives from Brunswick started knocking on doors in the area to check if anybody might remember what happened that night. There was an apartment building next to Jane's property, and some of the units had views of her home. After painstakingly making their way around the building, detectives Mark Harris and Wayne McDonald finally knocked on the door of one second-floor apartment. A towering guy in his late 20s with a strong build and unique wiry hair answered it. The striking resemblance between the man's features and Jane's description, including his hairstyle and physique, was quickly noticed by both investigators. As they proceeded to explain their purpose and inquired as to whether he had detected anything unusual, they were both taken aback by the man's peculiar behavior. A bite wound appeared on one of his thumbs as well. A search warrant was brought back by the investigators after they had gone. Upon entering the man's home, they saw that the window in his living room overlooked Jane's backyard. Some items that had been saturated in blood were among the filthy laundry. All signs pointed to Jane's blood. The investigators stumbled across a few newspaper articles about a murder that had occurred in 1980, the murder of Teresa Crow, while perusing an old journal entry. Uncle Joe Clarke was the man's name. He consented to a medical evaluation upon his arrest and subsequent transport to the station. Clarke informed Detective Mark Harris suddenly that he had a confession to make after the test. The guy said, "You were right. It was me. I went next door and had sex with the woman." Clarke came clean about his obsession with Jane, admitting that he had been secretly observing her from his apartment for a while. Ignoring the fact that Jane's husband would be away, he attacked her, claiming, "I have never been able to get sex from any woman voluntarily." He was sick of paying to see sex workers. In an effort to fool and frighten her, he pretended to be a prison escapee with accomplices waiting outside. Confirming the identical information that Jane had given, Clarke delivered a complete confession about the rape. Notification of the arrest was sent to the murder investigators who had been assigned the investigation of Teresa Crow 3 years before. The finest lead the cold case had ever had was the collection of news articles regarding Teresa's murder that was discovered in Clarke's house. Clarke had previously admitted to Jane that he had dismembered a victim before. Joe Clarke made another quick confession when the Crow case investigators showed up to question him. At the age of 17, Clarke met Teresa Crow in 1975. After a mutual acquaintance introduced them, Clarke couldn't stop thinking about them. At the discos that Teresa attended, he started stalking her. Over the course of the next 5 years, his obsession with her intensified, and on the evening of Thursday, June 19, 1980, he proposed to her at Chase's nightclub. Not knowing Clarke very well, Teresa scoffed at his offer and sent him an irritated glance before bolting from the nightclub not long after. Clarke accompanied her as she returned home. According to what Clarke told the cops, he went up to her loft apartment and rapped on the trap door. In her pajamas, Teresa welcomed him inside. He had been there before. In fact, Teresa had allowed him to sleep on her sofa once when he was too inebriated to get home. After Clarke brought Teresa her coffee, she undressed and lay face down on the ceiling-hung swinging sofa, claiming he had prepared coffee for both of them. While he was still clothed, he lay on top of her. During their consenting sexual experience, Clarke allegedly bit Teresa's back. Nevertheless, she started to resist as he grabbed her arms. The desire for sexual relations between Clarke and Teresa was rejected. As a result, he dove headfirst into masturbation as she slept. Teresa was still and not breathing when he awoke, still on top of her. When Clarke's heart began to stop, he lowered her to the floor and attempted CPR. He next tried to mutilate Teresa's corpse with a sharp piece of metal to make her accidental death seem like an esoteric sacrifice. But this failed as well. After he finished cleaning the flat, he shut the door and tossed the key down the drain. The cops were completely unconvinced by Joe Clarke's account. After he removed Teresa's nightgown and pushed her face down into the sofa, they thought he had attacked her sexually, just like he had attacked Jane. As he pressed her head on the sofa arm, he had severed her airway, murdering her. Subsequently, Joe Clarke was found guilty of manslaughter in relation to Teresa Crow and handed a 15-year prison term, which was the maximum ever handed out in Victoria for manslaughter at the time. In a subsequent appeal, Clarke had the harshness of his sentence lowered to 9 years with a mandatory minimum of 7. He received an extra 4 years for raping Jane. In 2001, over 20 years after the fact, while investigating the cold case murder of 6-year-old Bonnie Clarke, Detective Tim Day came upon Joe Clarke's criminal activities. Mal Clarke, who had been mentioned as a potential suspect by Bonnie's acquaintance, was the person whose data he had been looking for. Kylie Ward, a childhood friend of Bonnie's, claims that Mal Clarke lived with Bonnie and her mother as a boarder. Bonnie had informed Kylie that she disliked him because of his scary conduct. Joe Clarke was classified as an assistant projectionist at a Greater Union Cinema when he was arrested in 1983, according to Detective Day's review of his case file. Additionally, Mal Clarke had worked as an assistant projectionist at that same theater. After doing some more research, I learned that Malcolm Joseph Thomas Clarke was Joe Clarke's entire name. Despite using a new name, he was identical to the boarder who had leased out Marion Clarke's extra room. December 1982 was the murder of Bonnie, 2 years after Teresa Crow's murder and 8 months before the rape of Jane that resulted in Clarke's imprisonment. Another thing, in 1983, when looking into Jane's rape, authorities searched Malcolm Clarke's house and discovered a greeting card sent to Bonnie Clarke, along with some children's socks and underwear from a budget shop. The detectives from Brunswick had already alerted their counterparts in Northcote to the potential link to Bonnie Clarke, just as they had done with the investigators tasked with solving the death of Teresa Crow. The investigation into Bonnie's death was still being overseen by Detective Eric Lilly. Before he was certain that Marion, Bonnie's mother, was the murderer, he had a brief conversation with Malcolm Clarke soon after Bonnie's death, but had already ruled Clarke out as a possibility. Hearing from his colleagues in Brunswick, Detective Lilly consented to meet with Clarke once again. A greeting card that Clarke had written for Bonnie when she was alive but never sent was the excuse he used to explain away the card. The identity of the owner of the children's underpants discovered in Marion Clarke's house was uncertain. According to Detective Lilly, who informed his colleagues in Brunswick about the murder of Bonnie, they were confident that Marion Clarke was responsible since it did not match the MO of the charges for which Malcolm Clarke had been convicted. However, the parallels between the 3 murders shocked cold case detective Tim Day in 2001. Each case included a sexual assault of some type, a knife attack on the victim, and the subsequent cleaning of the crime scene. Malcolm Clarke knew the victims all on some level. He was even acquainted with their houses and habits. Actually, Marion had informed investigators about Malcolm Clarke and insisted that they interview him on the day of Bonnie's death. Clarke was located by the investigators, but his alibi, that he had been working at the movie theater, ruled him out. No evidence was found by Detective Tim Day to suggest that the first investigators had confirmed this alibi. Detective Day pondered if he could finally pull it off almost 2 decades later. Although it was a lengthy process, the investigator eventually located the 1982 shift records for Greater Union Cinemas. These documents proved that in December 1982, Malcolm Clarke had worked for the corporation at one of its movie theaters. He started his shift at 9:25 a.m., leaving around 4:25 in the afternoon. Ended on Monday, December 20th, 1982, long before Bonnie Clarke was assaulted that evening. On Wednesday, December 22nd, Malcolm Clarke returned to work after taking the next day off. He couldn't use his alibi to avoid responsibility for Bonnie's death. Malcolm Joseph Thomas Clarke, who was 47 years old at the time, was let free at the beginning of 2002. 8 years before, in 1994, he had been granted parole and had established a fresh life for himself after his jail term. He had just become engaged to a woman, worked as a personal care attendant, and spent his free time doing things he loved. As a rail fanatic, Clarke was especially fond of the narrow-gauge historic railway Puffing Billy, which weaves its way through the Dandenong Ranges foothills in Victoria. One of the world's most famous steam heritage railroads, it was opened to the public in 1900. Passengers and families from all over the globe come to see Puffing Billy, which starts in Belgrave and ends in Gembrook. In the year 2000, Malcolm Clarke became one of Puffing Billy's volunteer guards because he, too, was captivated by the steam locomotive. Being a part of the legendary railway was enough compensation for him, even if he didn't earn any money for the position. At the Belgrave rail station, where Puffing Billy began his journey in March 2002, Malcolm Clarke started up a discussion with another train nut. Despite his rugged appearance, he resembled an elderly motorcyclist. Phil shared Clarke's enthusiasm for Puffing Billy. In the following months, the two guys became friends after hitting it off. The fact that Phil was an ally of a criminal group became clear very quickly. After a while, Clarke started to go along with Phil on his illicit adventures, such as robbing a factory, collecting enormous sums of money from a brothel, and surreptitiously photographing a lady having an affair. Several of Phil's criminal acquaintances were assembled in a hotel lounge when he brought Clarke there on Friday, May 17, 2002. He then described these people and pointed them out to Clarke. Two of them were corrupt police officers and Steve, the boss or chief executive officer, to whom Phil was ultimately accountable. In an effort to get a major contract, Phil told Clarke that Steve was investigating him. A few weeks down the road, Phil had Clarke meet up with the crooked cop behind the Victoria Police Headquarters on St. Kilda Road in Melbourne for another mission. Malcolm Clarke seemed to relish his newfound association with organized crime, despite his seeming virtuous behavior after his release from jail. Clarke was informed that he would be paid $8,000 for his assistance in Phil's jewelry heist. His previous income from working as a personal care attendant, one of his few viable jobs, was far lower than this. Because Clarke needed the additional funds for his wedding and honeymoon, he was grateful for the opportunity. A story on Bonnie Clarke's cold case murder was published in the Herald Sun newspaper on Sunday, June 2nd. A 20-year-old child sex murder case may now have a solution, according to DNA evidence. According to Malcolm Clarke, who perused the piece. Featuring all new details, it was a sequel to a case report that had appeared a year earlier. Police are looking into a lead that suggests a boarder who lived with the family may have been Bonnie's murderer, according to Homicide Squad Detective Ron Idles. Before Bonnie's death, the home had been leased out to 12 or 14 individuals, and they intended to question each and every one of them. They held out hope that by analyzing hair samples, cigarette butts, and fingernail scrapings collected from the murder scene, all of which were made possible by recent advances in DNA technology, they may identify the culprit. A calling card was placed at Malcolm Clarke's apartment the night after he came home. Detective Idles was the rightful owner. While Clarke was at work, he dropped by to see his fiancée Lynn and left a note requesting that Clarke come to the station for polygraph and DNA tests. Clarke was terrified by this news. He immediately called Phil, his pal. Clarke said to Phil, "I can tell you, I had nothing to do with it." Despite learning that his new acquaintance may be a suspect in a case involving the death of a kid, Phil was unfazed. "If you've done it, I don't care," he said Clarke. "We can't start moving forward until we have all the information. How will the polygraph report turn out? Are there any secrets you'd want to keep?" According to Clarke, he didn't. "If you do, we can eliminate it," Phil chimed in. Phil persisted, even after Clarke denied being involved in the crime. As a result of his ties in the Victoria Police, he assured Clarke that he could assist him in eliminating the problem, but only if Clarke was forthright. "I had just recently gotten my life in order, reclaiming my passions," Clarke grumbled. "I never expected this to turn up. You have no idea how I'm feeling at the moment." After staying in contact with the young girl after moving out, Clarke continued to open up to Phil the next day about his time as a guest in Bonnie Clarke's house. During his short stay as a tenant at Bonnie's home, he would sometimes cross the fence to have a conversation with Moran, her mother. According to Clarke, Bonnie used to become afraid when she was home alone. When that happened, he'd welcome her inside, where she'd relax on a beanbag and watch TV for a little before leaving. When Moran came back, Clarke said he hadn't seen Bonnie since October 1982, when he returned to live with his parents. 2 months down the road, on December 21st, he was engrossed in his news show when he came upon the story of Bonnie's murder from the previous night. He learned about Bonnie's injury for the first time at that moment. It was Phil's intention to assist Clarke if the latter was really a suspect, Phil said. Despite his concern for Clarke and enjoyment of their work together, news had already reached Steve, the boss, that Clarke may be in danger. Phil wanted all the details so he could assist Clarke in passing a police polygraph test, and Steve needed this situation settled too. If Clarke wasn't being entirely forthright, Steve would just leave him without a second thought, and the $8,000 he was due from the jewelry robbery would never have come to him. At the Crown Casino Hotel in Melbourne's central business district, Phil escorted Malcolm Clarke to an official interview with Steve for a job position. Steve and another partner were waiting for them in a separate room. On one side of a low coffee table sat Steve, while on the other, Clarke took a seat on a sofa. Steve welcomed Clarke and Phil before getting right to work. Only if he could have complete faith in Clarke would he welcome Clarke to their group. Clarke would gain a lot of money if he joined their group. If he wanted to, he might leave his low-paying job and save up enough money to own his own train. The catch was that Clarke had just emerged as the prime suspect in the 1982 killing of a child aged 6, according to homicide authorities. Steve informed Clarke that he was already under a great deal of police scrutiny and said, "You are really hot right now, aren't you?" He then handed Clarke a paper to review. Not quite a month had passed before the Victoria Police seal appeared on the 3-page secret report. The date was May 15, 2002. The pages of the manuscript were digitized by Clarke. Among the most recent developments in the Bonnie Clarke case was the revelation that, according to their account, the police seemed to have obtained the suspect's DNA from artifacts found at the site of the killing. All they needed now was a DNA sample from Clarke to compare. Steve informed Clarke that while investigators could get a court order compelling him to provide a sample, the problem might be resolved totally via Steve's shady contacts inside the police department. Clarke had to tell Steve everything before he would pay the $5,000 price tag. Steve was ready to pay any amount. Steve warned that the problem will persist. Until the cows come home, you can deny it. I can't stand having you around. See why I'm saying this? After responding, "Yes," Clarke went into deep silence. He started to talk at last. "Oh my God, that was just a coincidence. Her name is she. Lost their lives." Malcolm Clarke informed Steve that he had been drinking in a Brunswick bar late on Monday night, December 20th, 1982. His inebriated decision to play with Bonnie at Moran Clarke's house in Northcote was puzzling, yet he left the bar and was either a walker or a tram rider, so he was well versed with the area. He climbed over the fence into the backyard after walking down the alley that was at the back of the property. Clarke went up the hallway to Bonnie's bedroom after entering the home via the back sliding door. On the top bunk across from Bonnie's single bed sat her little pet dog, and her bedside light was turned on. Clarke approached Bonnie as she slept and started sexually abusing her. When she awoke, she was about to scream, but Clarke quickly pinned her down with a cushion and his other arm. After raising her hand in protest, Bonnie's arm gradually grew slack, and she lowered it again. This made Clarke feel a surge of fear. He said his intention was to keep Bonnie silent, not to murder her. Because of his history of trouble with some local youngsters, Clarke claimed to have carried a tiny carving knife as a means of self-defense. According to what he told Steve, he stabbed Bonnie on the spur of the moment as she froze. Since the wound wasn't gushing blood, Clarke reasoned that Bonnie had already died when he stabbed her. Therefore, he may have held the knife and pushed it into the side of her chest wall. According to Clarke, he undressed Bonnie but then used a towel or cloth to wipe her off and then took it with him. After that, he drew her blanket to her chin and then ran screaming out the back door. He reckoned he'd only spent a total of 10 to 15 minutes inside the residence. The next day, he changed into clean clothing and finally discarded his shoes, but he still couldn't put his finger on what he had done with the knife. He was concerned that he could have misplaced the sheath. Clarke could tell there was no trace of semen at the site, so he wondered whether the DNA had originated there or in his saliva. Clarke had been sure no one would ever suspect him until the DNA reveal, since he had never harmed Bonnie before that fateful night. Steve said he needed to make some calls after hearing Malcolm Clarke's confession, and Phil offered to take Clarke out for coffee. Meanwhile, Phil and Clarke returned to Phil's vehicle. As they continued their journey, Phil informed Clarke that he needed to settle an issue with a corrupt police officer they were acquainted with. Just like before, he got in his car and started driving toward the police headquarters on St. Kilda Road via the back entrance. Tim Day and Ron Idols, two detectives, were waiting to apprehend Malcolm Clarke. Detective Day had his suspicions about Malcolm Clarke as the main suspect in Bonnie Clarke's murder after his investigation the year before. A covert operation was something he started to advocate for. Undercover cops would often use a strategy known as the Canadian model, or Mr. Big, to get criminals to confess by having them join fictitious gangs. This method, which originated in the 1960s with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, has now spread to other nations' police forces, including Australia's. In episode 54 of Case File, the disappearance of Danny Moram, a youngster from Queensland, was investigated using the Canadian model. Australian courts have repeatedly supported this contentious practice, despite criticism it has received. The Canadian model seemed like the perfect strategy for getting Malcolm Clarke to confess in order for Detective Tim Day to solve the Bonnie Clarke case. Operation Marauder was the name given to the newly developed plan. An undercover agent contacted Clarke while posing as Phil, and the rest is history as part of Operation Marauder. The cops had been documenting their encounters with Clarke and gradually becoming a part of his life for months. Phil had pointed out to Clarke the manufactured Herald Sun news piece about a DNA breakthrough, and the purpose of its exposure was to frighten Clarke. Quechua. Absolutely no DNA had been retrieved from the site of the crime. Similar to the real case progress report, the one Steve gave Clarke from the Victoria Police was fabricated and meant to frighten Clarke. Sneaky cameras and microphones strategically placed around the hotel room had recorded his last confession. At 7:45 p.m., once Clarke finished, the undercover cop drove Malcolm Clarke to the Victoria Police headquarters to be arrested. A formal interview with Malcolm Clarke was initiated by Detective Tim Day on Thursday, June 6, 2002. Clarke gave up on his fabrication when confronted with the prospect of confessing to the imaginary criminal organization. The murder of Bonnie was described in great detail by him, down to the bedroom. He went on to say that he had been drunk as a skunk. Clarke confessed to digitally raping, suffocating, and stabbing the 6-year-old. He reiterated that he had no desire to harm Bonnie, stating, "God knows why I went round to that place, and whatever happened, happened. When I came to my senses, I realized that Bonnie was deceased." Following this, Malcolm Clarke was apprehended and placed on remand on charges related to Bonnie Clarke's murder. 2 years later, Malcolm Clarke pled not guilty when his trial started in Victoria's Supreme Court, having repudiated his admissions in the meantime. Clarke, who is now 49 years old, said that he confessed to murdering Bonnie only because he thought it would help him be employed by the criminal organization. After what seemed like an extension of his confession in the hotel room, Clarke was taken to police headquarters by the undercover officer he knew as Phil. Clarke, according to his attorney, failed to see the truth and instead assumed that detectives Ron Idles and Tim Day were crooked cops working with the gang. He chose to keep up appearances rather than assert his right to remain silent and seek legal representation. There were inconsistencies between Clarke's testimony and the crime scene, which the defense used to argue that his confession was fake. Bonnie was discovered nude, with her pajamas stuffed between the bed and the wall, contradicting Clarke's allegation that she was fully clad in her pajamas when he left her. Despite Clarke's claims that he had suffocated Bonnie, her neck had injuries that suggested either strangulation or a violent grip. The defense said that Clarke's knowledge of the victim's home and news stories allowed him to supply some accurate facts. But the prosecution brought forth elements that the media had omitted, things that Clarke had accurately reported. The digital rape of Bonnie, the absence of sperm at the site, the nature of the stabbing wound to her chest, and its precise manner of infliction were all factors. Clarke said that he had heard in the media that Bonnie had been strangled to death. The autopsy results, on the other hand, corroborated Clarke's assertion that Bonnie had been suffocated and had not fought for her life. In response to questions posed by the examiner, Clarke somewhat adjusted his version of events, saying that the details he had supplied had originated from discussions he had had with investigators 20 years before, while doing time for his prior offenses. Among these detectives, he mentioned the one who first spearheaded the investigation, Detective Eric Lilly, and added that he preferred not to mention others. Although Detective Lilly did talk with Clarke shortly after his 1983 arrest, neither the conversation nor Clarke's official statement was documented. If there were any differences between the murder scene and Clarke's confession, the prosecution said, it was because Clarke had forgotten some aspects over time. His assertion that he had thought he was still conversing with gang members was completely implausible because the investigators informed him they were from the murder squad and warned him before commencing their questioning. The jury, which included 3 women and 9 males, was not informed about Malcolm Clarke's history of convictions for rape and manslaughter. They had no idea that their instances were comparable to Bonnie's or that he had a history of victims. The jury found the defendant guilty on Thursday, June 17, 2004. A life sentence with a minimum of 25 years was handed down to Malcolm Clarke. Upon hearing his destiny, Clarke pivoted to survey the audience gallery. Among the throng, he saw Detective Tim Day and one of his undercover cops, whom he stared at angrily while silently threatening. In response, they locked eyes with him. Dennis, Bonnie Clarke's father, died 2 months subsequent to Malcolm Clarke's sentencing. After a lengthy battle with illness, he managed to survive long enough to see his daughter's due punishment. To a reporter, Dennis said, "It's the best news I have ever had. After 21 years, I am so glad. I just think I'll get on with my life a lot better and not look at everyone and say, 'This isn't the person. Now I know.'" This was said during the time of Clarke's conviction. The conviction of Clarke was very satisfying for Marion Wishart, Bonnie's mother, since it meant that the person responsible for her child's murder was now facing justice. The first detectives had put their eyes on Marion, and ever since then, suspicion had followed her. Now, Marion was finally free. Before the cold case team took up Bonnie's case, police officers would contact Marion every so often to see how she was doing, but it never seemed like they were really following up with the victim. It seemed more like a covert signal that she remained their primary suspect. In the 2 decades after Bonnie's murder, Marion often woke up in the wee hours of the morning, consumed with the unsettling notion that the man responsible for her death might potentially do damage to others. The identity of the killer was ultimately revealed, confirming her worst suspicions. It broke Marion's heart that in 1983, Clarke was able to violently rape at least one more lady without drawing any notice from the authorities. Upon discovering Bonnie's corpse, she attempted to alert the authorities that Malcolm Clarke may be a suspect, but no one paid attention to her. Marion Wishart succumbed to pneumonia in 2018. Ian Monroe, a journalist who had previously worked for the Sunday Age, talked with Marion before she passed away. Marion gushed about her daughter Bonnie, remembering her as a fiery and humorous young girl throughout the conversation. The strong bond that Bonnie had with her made-up companion Chitty was one of Marion's most cherished recollections. Once, Bonnie freaked out because Chitty hadn't gotten on the tram with her and her mother. Marion pretended to go get Chitty from the street and begged the driver to stop in an effort to calm her daughter. As Marion set Bonnie's imaginary companion down next to her, the other passengers couldn't help but giggle. When asked about her grief at the loss of her daughter, Marion said, "She's there all the time. There really isn't a time when Bonnie's not with